The carriage wheels ground against the dusty Alabama road with a rhythm that matched Edith Crowhaven's racing heartbeat. Through the grimy window, she watched the familiar yet foreign landscape of her childhood unfold. Cotton fields stretching endlessly under the merciless August sun, their white bolls gleaming like scattered bones. The air hung thick with humidity and the sweet, cloying scent of magnolia blossoms that seemed to mask something far more sinister. "Miss, we're approaching the Crowhaven estate," the driver called back, his voice tight with unease. Even from her position inside the carriage, Edith could see his shoulders tense as they neared the imposing wrought-iron gates that marked the boundary of her family's cursed land. Edith pressed her gloved hand against the window, her breath fogging the glass. 23 years old, she had spent the last decade in Boston, far from the whispered rumors and sideways glances that followed the Crowhaven name like a plague. Her parents' deaths 3 months ago had been sudden, a carriage accident, the telegram had said. Though the details remained frustratingly vague, she had intended to sell the estate site unseen, to finally sever all ties with this godforsaken place. Then the letter arrived. "Miss Crowhaven, it had begun in spidery handwriting. Your return is imperative. The family curse stirs once more, and only a true Crowhaven can prevent what is to come. The house remembers, the house hungers. Come quickly before it is too late." It was unsigned, but something about those words had crawled under her skin and refused to let go. Against all reason, she had boarded the first train south. The carriage lurched to a stop before the estate's main gate, and Edith stepped out into the oppressive heat. The driver, a weathered man named Samuel, who had known her father, refused to meet her eyes as he unloaded her trunks. "I'll be leaving you here, Miss Edith," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "Won't be going no further onto Crowhaven land, not after dark and not ever." Samuel, surely you don't believe those old superstitions. Ain't superstition when you've seen what I've seen," he interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Your daddy, God rest his soul, he tried to warn folks. Said the house was sick, said it was hungry. Most thought he'd gone mad like the rest of his kin." Samuel's eyes finally met hers, filled with a mixture of pity and fear. Maybe he had. Maybe that's what saved him from something worse. Before Edith could respond, Samuel had climbed back onto his carriage and was already urging his horses away, leaving her alone before the towering gates of her ancestral home. The Crowhaven estate loomed before her like a Gothic nightmare made manifest. 3 stories of weathered brick and rotting timber stretched toward the darkening sky, its windows like hollow eyes staring down at her with malevolent intent. Ivy crawled up the walls like grasping fingers, and several of the upper-story shutters hung at odd angles, giving the house a lopsided, diseased appearance. As Edith pushed open the rusted gate, it shrieked in protest, the sound echoing across the overgrown grounds like a banshee's wail. The path to the front door was cracked and overrun with weeds, and the ancient oak trees that lined it seemed to lean inward, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the dying sunlight struggled to penetrate. The front door stood slightly ajar. Edith's hand trembled as she reached for the tarnished brass handle. The wood was swollen with moisture and age, and it took considerable effort to push it open wide enough to enter. The hinges groaned like something in pain, and the sound seemed to reverberate through the house's interior, announcing her arrival to whatever dwelt within. The foyer was a study in decay. Dust motes danced in the few shafts of light that managed to filter through the grimy windows, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something organic and unpleasant that made her stomach turn. A grand staircase curved upward into shadow, its once elegant banister now warped and splintered. "Hello!" Edith called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is anyone here?" The house answered with silence, but it was not an empty silence. It was the kind of quiet that suggested something was listening, waiting, holding its breath. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, Edith began to make out the details of her surroundings. Family portraits lined the walls, their subjects' eyes seeming to track her movement through the room. The faces were uniformly pale and gaunt, with the distinctive Crowhaven features, sharp cheekbones, deep-set eyes, and thin lips that never quite seemed to smile. Many of the paintings showed signs of deliberate damage, scratched-out eyes, torn canvas, and in one particularly disturbing case, what appeared to be dried blood splattered across the subject's face. A grandfather clock stood silent in the corner, its hands frozen at 3:17. Edith wondered if that had been the exact moment her parents died, if time itself had stopped in this cursed place to mark their passing. She moved deeper into the house, her footsteps echoing hollowly on the warped floorboards. The parlor was a monument to faded grandeur, once fine furniture now covered in dust sheets that looked like shrouds in the dim light. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel adorned with more family photographs and what appeared to be small animal skulls arranged in some sort of pattern. It was then that she noticed the diary. It sat on a small side table, as if someone had been reading it recently and simply set it aside. The leather cover was cracked and stained, and the pages were yellowed with age. Edith approached it cautiously, her heart pounding as she recognized the handwriting on the open page. It was her mother's journal, August 15th, 1899. The dreams are getting worse. I see them in the walls now, the faces of all the Crowhavens who came before. They whisper to me in languages I don't understand, but somehow I know what they're saying. They're hungry. They've always been hungry, and now that we're the last ones left, they're getting desperate. Thomas thinks I'm losing my mind, but he's wrong. I'm not going mad. I'm finally seeing clearly. The house isn't just our home, it's our prison, and we're not its owners, we're its food. I've hidden this journal where Edith will find it when she returns, because she will return. The house will call to her just as it called to all of us. I pray she's stronger than we were. I pray she can break the cycle, but I fear she's already lost. Edith's hands shook as she read the words. Her mother had written this entry just days before her death, and the implications were terrifying. She flipped through the earlier pages, finding months of increasingly erratic entries describing nightmares, visions, and a growing sense that the house itself was alive and malevolent. A sound from upstairs made her freeze, a slow, deliberate creaking, as if someone was walking across the floorboards above, but that was impossible. The house had been empty for months. The creaking came again, closer this time, and Edith realized with growing horror that whatever was making the sound was moving toward the staircase. She clutched the diary to her chest and backed toward the front door, but before she could reach it, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, came a sound that made her blood run cold, a low, mournful wailing that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. It rose and fell like a lament, and within its haunting melody, Edith could swear she heard voices calling her name. Edith. Edith, come home, child, come home. She turned and ran, bursting through the front door and into the gathering dusk. But even as she fled down the overgrown path, she could feel the house watching her, waiting for her inevitable return. Because deep down, she knew her mother had been right. She was already lost. Dawn broke grey and oppressive over Duskfield, the sun struggling to penetrate the thick canopy of clouds that had rolled in during the night. Edith had spent the dark hours in the town's only inn, a ramshackle establishment called the Magnolia Rest, where the proprietor, Mrs. Henley, had crossed herself upon hearing the Crowhaven name and insisted on burning sage in Edith's room for protection. Sleep had been impossible. Every time Edith closed her eyes, she heard that mournful wailing echoing through her mind, and she felt the weight of countless unseen eyes watching her from the shadows. The diary lay open on the nightstand beside her bed, its pages filled with her mother's increasingly desperate handwriting. July the 3rd, 1899. Found another room today, hidden behind the pantry wall. The smell was overwhelming, like something had died and been left to rot. Thomas wouldn't let me explore it properly, but I saw enough. Symbols carved into the walls, strange stains on the floor, and in the center of it all, an altar of sorts. What were our ancestors doing in there? What kind of rituals required such preparations? I'm beginning to understand why so many Crowhavens have gone mad over the years. It's not heredity, it's the house itself. It feeds on us, drives us to madness, and then it takes what it needs. As the morning light grew stronger, Edith made a decision. She would return to the estate, but this time she would be prepared. She dressed in her most practical clothing, a dark wool skirt and white blouse that wouldn't show dirt, and purchased supplies from the general store, oil lamps, matches, rope, and a small revolver that the shopkeeper reluctantly sold her after she explained her destination. "You sure about this, miss?" the elderly man asked, his weathered face creased with concern. "Ain't nobody been out to that place since your folks passed. Some say it's better left alone." "I need to understand what happened to my parents," Edith replied, checking the revolver's chambers. "And I need to put an end to whatever's been plaguing my family for generations." The shopkeeper shook his head sadly. "Your daddy said something similar. Last time I saw him, said he was going to cleanse the house of its demons. I found him 3 days later, wandering the woods in his nightclothes, talking to people who weren't there. Your mama had to bring him home like a lost child." This was news to Edith. The letters she had received from her parents over the years had made no mention of her father's deteriorating mental state. They had painted a picture of quiet retirement, of peaceful days spent tending the estate's gardens and reading in the library. But now she was beginning to suspect that those letters had been carefully crafted lies, designed to keep her away from the truth. The walk back to the estate felt different in daylight. The oppressive atmosphere remained, but Edith could now see details that had been hidden in the previous evening's gloom. The grounds were more extensive than she remembered, stretching back toward the dark line of trees that marked the beginning of the Duskfield woods. Outbuildings dotted the landscape, a carriage house, a smokehouse, what appeared to be the ruins of slave quarters from the estate's antebellum past. But it was the family cemetery that caught her attention. Hidden behind a grove of weeping willows, the small graveyard was enclosed by a wrought iron fence that matched the estate's main gate. Moss-covered headstones leaned at drunken angles, and many bore the Crowhaven name. As Edith pushed through the rusted gate, she was struck by how many of the graves were marked with death dates that suggested the occupants had died young, in their 20s and 30s, far too early for natural causes. Her parents' graves were the newest additions, their headstones still sharp-edged and unmarked by weather. But it was the inscription on her father's stone that made her blood run cold. Thomas Crowhaven, 1845-1899. He tried to break the chain, and below that, in smaller letters, "The house always wins." Edith stared at the words, her mind racing. Who had chosen this inscription? Certainly not the local undertaker, who would never have agreed to something so ominous. Someone else had been here after the burial. Someone who knew the truth about the Crowhaven curse. A rustling in the nearby bushes made her spin around, her hand instinctively reaching for the revolver. But there was nothing there, just the wind stirring the leaves and the distant cry of a crow. She made her way back to the main house, steeling herself for what she might find inside. The front door stood open just as she had left it, and the interior was exactly as she remembered, dusty, decaying, and filled with an almost palpable sense of malevolence. This time, however, Edith was determined to explore thoroughly. She lit one of her oil lamps and began a systematic search of the ground floor, looking for the hidden room her mother had mentioned in the diary. The kitchen was a study in neglect. Dishes still sat in the sink, covered in a film of mold, and the pantry shelves were lined with jars of preserves that had long since spoiled. It was behind the pantry, just as her mother had written, that Edith found the concealed door. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a section of wall, but closer inspection revealed the faint outline of a door frame hidden beneath layers of paint and wallpaper. She ran her fingers along the edges until she found a small depression that served as a handle. The door swung inward with a groan, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into absolute darkness. The smell that wafted up from below was indescribable, a mixture of decay, incense, and something metallic that made her gag. But Edith forced herself to descend, her lamp casting dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. The hidden room was larger than she had expected, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the house. The walls were covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the lamplight. Some appeared to be crude attempts at Latin, others looked like no language she had ever seen. Dark stains covered the floor in intricate patterns, and in the center of the room stood what could only be described as an altar. It was made of black stone, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. Channels had been carved into its top, leading to a basin at one end that was stained a rusty brown. Around the altar, the floor was littered with bones, some clearly animal, others disturbingly ambiguous in origin. But it was the walls that truly horrified her. Carved into the stone were hundreds of names, each accompanied by a date. Edith recognized many of them from the family cemetery, but there were others, names that didn't appear on any headstone, dates that stretched back over 2 centuries. At the bottom of each entry, in the same spidery handwriting she had seen in the anonymous letter, were brief notations: fed the hunger, gave willingly, resisted, taken by force. And at the very bottom of the wall, in fresh carving that still showed white stone beneath, were 2 new entries. Thomas Crowhaven, 1899, tried to break the chain. Margaret Crowhaven, 1899, died protecting the secret. Edith's lamp trembled in her shaking hands as she read the words. Her parents hadn't died in a carriage accident. They had been murdered, sacrificed to whatever dark entity the Crowhaven family had been serving for generations. A sound from above made her freeze, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the house. But that was impossible. She had locked the front door behind her, and there was no other way in. The footsteps paused directly above the hidden room, and then she heard it, a voice muffled by the stone ceiling, but unmistakably familiar. Edith? Edith, darling, where are you? It was her mother's voice. Edith's blood turned to ice as she heard the voice again, closer this time, as if the speaker was descending the stairs to the pantry. I know you're down there, sweetheart. Come up and see me. We have so much to discuss. But her mother was dead. Edith had seen the grave, had read the death certificate. Whatever was calling to her from above was not her mother. It was something else, something that had taken her voice and was using it to lure her into a trap. She extinguished her lamp and pressed herself against the far wall of the hidden room, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard throughout the house. The footsteps moved through the kitchen, pausing at the pantry door. I can smell you, Edith. The scent of Crowhaven blood is unmistakable. You can't hide from me forever. The voice was changing now, becoming less human with each word. There was a wet, gurgling quality to it that made Edith's skin crawl, as if the speaker's throat was filled with something thick and viscous. Your parents thought they could protect you by sending you away, but they were wrong. The blood calls to blood, and you belong here with us. You belong to the house. The footsteps began to descend the hidden stairs. Edith fumbled for her revolver, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip it. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied now by a sound like something wet being dragged across stone. In the absolute darkness of the hidden room, she could see nothing, but she could hear the thing that wore her mother's voice approaching. Don't be afraid, darling. It only hurts for a moment, and then you'll understand everything. You'll see why the Crowhavens have served the house for so long. You'll see why we can never leave. The sound stopped just at the bottom of the stairs, and Edith held her breath, praying that whatever it was couldn't see her in the darkness. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, in a voice that was no longer even remotely human, it spoke again. "I know you're here, little Crowhaven. I can taste your fear. But I'm patient. I've waited this long. I can wait a little longer. The house is hungry, and you're the last course of a feast that's been centuries in the making." The wet, dragging sound resumed, but this time it was moving away, back up the stairs. Edith waited until she was certain it was gone before relighting her lamp and making her way back to the main floor. The kitchen was empty, but the air still carried the lingering scent of decay. On the table, written in what appeared to be fresh blood, was a message. "Welcome home, Edith. The family reunion begins tonight." Edith spent the remainder of the day in the estate's library, a vast room lined with books that chronicled the Crowhaven family's dark history. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight that filtered through tall windows, and the air was thick with the smell of old leather and decaying paper. She had barricaded herself inside, pushing a heavy oak desk against the door, though she suspected such precautions would prove futile against whatever supernatural forces plagued the house. The family records painted a picture of systematic horror, stretching back to the estate's founding in 1687. The first Crowhaven, Jeremiah, had been a Puritan minister who had fled Salem during the witch trials, not as a victim, but as a practitioner of the very dark arts he had publicly condemned. His journal, written in archaic English, detailed his discovery of what he called the hungry presence that dwelt in the Alabama wilderness. "The Lord hath delivered unto me a great and terrible power," Jeremiah had written. "In the deep woods, where the Cherokee once made their blood offerings, I have found that which hungers for the essence of man. It promises dominion over death itself, but the price is the soul of my lineage, generation unto generation, until the end of days." Each subsequent generation had added their own accounts to the family archives. Edith read of midnight rituals in the hidden chamber, of family members who had volunteered to feed the entity's hunger, and of those who had tried to resist and met gruesome ends. The pattern was always the same. The Crowhaven bloodline was bound to serve, and those who attempted to break free were consumed by madness before being claimed by the house itself. Her great-grandfather's journal was particularly disturbing. The thing in the walls grows stronger with each feeding. It no longer content itself with the occasional sacrifice. It demands more, always more. My own son, barely 16, has begun to hear its whispers. I see him standing in the corridors at night, speaking to shadows that move independently of any light source. God help us all. But I fear we have awakened something that should have remained dormant. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the library floor, Edith found her father's final journal entries. His handwriting, once neat and precise, had deteriorated into an almost illegible scrawl. "It's in my head now, whispering constantly. Margaret tries to help, but she doesn't understand. The house has marked us both. We're the last of the bloodline, and it's growing desperate. The hunger is so intense now that I can feel it in my bones, a gnawing emptiness that nothing can fill. I've tried everything, salt circles, holy water, even burning sage in every room. Nothing works. The entity isn't bound by conventional supernatural rules because it's not a ghost or demon. It's something older, something that existed before such distinctions mattered. Edith must never return. I've written to her, told her the estate is to be sold, that there's nothing here for her. But I know it won't matter. The blood calls to blood, and she'll come back eventually. When she does, God help her, because I won't be able to. The final entry was dated just 3 days before her parents' deaths. Margaret and I have made our decision. We're going to try to destroy the altar, to break the connection between our family and the entity. If we fail, then at least we'll die as ourselves. not as puppets dancing to the tune of something that should never have been awakened. To whoever finds this, probably Edith, knowing the house's cruel sense of irony, know that we loved you enough to die for you, but also know that our sacrifice will likely be meaningless. The house always wins. It always has. D. As darkness fell outside the library windows, Edith heard the sounds beginning again. Footsteps in the corridors, voices calling her name, and underneath it all, that low, mournful wailing that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the house. She lit several oil lamps and arranged them around the room, creating a circle of light that she hoped might provide some protection. It was then that she noticed the family portrait hanging above the fireplace. She had seen it earlier but hadn't paid it much attention, just another example of the Crowhaven family's obsession with documenting their cursed lineage. But now, in the flickering lamplight, she could see that something was wrong with it. The paint seemed to shift and move, and the faces of her ancestors appeared to be watching her with expressions of malevolent hunger. As she stared at the portrait, one of the figures, a woman in a Victorian dress who bore a striking resemblance to Edith herself, began to move. The painted lips curved into a smile that was both beautiful and terrible, and the eyes seemed to focus directly on her. "Hello, dear cousin," the figure said, its voice emanating from the canvas itself. "I am Constance Crowhaven, and I died in this very room in 1847. Would you like to know how?" Edith stumbled backward, knocking over one of the oil lamps. The flame guttered and died, plunging that section of the room into shadow. In the darkness, she could hear movement, not just from the portrait, but from all around the library. Books were falling from shelves, and the air was filled with the sound of rustling pages and whispered conversations. "Don't be afraid," Constance continued, her painted form now stepping partially out of the frame. "Death is not the end for the Crowhavens. It's merely a transition. We remain here, bound to the house, serving the hunger that can never be satisfied. And soon you'll join us." Other voices began to join in, a chorus of the dead that filled the library with their lamentations. "The house is hungry, Edith. Feed it as we fed it. Your blood is the key. Break the chain, and we all suffer." Edith pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the voices, but they seemed to come from inside her own head. The temperature in the room was dropping rapidly, and her breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. Frost was forming on the windows, and the remaining oil lamps flickered as if struggling against some unseen force. "You cannot escape your heritage," Constance said, now fully emerged from the portrait and standing just a few feet away. Her Victorian dress was stained with what appeared to be blood, and her pale skin had a translucent quality that made her appear more like a projection than a solid being. "The Crowhaven blood carries with it both a gift and a curse. We can speak with the dead, commune with forces beyond the veil, but the price is our eternal servitude to the entity that grants us these abilities." "I don't want any gifts," Edith said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just want to leave this place and never come back." Constance laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, my dear child, you still don't understand. You can't leave because you're already dead. You died the moment you set foot on Crowhaven land. What you're experiencing now is merely the transition, your consciousness slowly being absorbed into the house itself." "That's not true," Edith said. But even as she spoke the words, she began to doubt them. The events of the past 2 days had taken on a dreamlike quality, and she was finding it increasingly difficult to distinguish between reality and nightmare. "Look at your hands," Constance commanded. Edith looked down and gasped. Her hands were becoming translucent, just like Constance's. She could see the library floor through her own flesh, and when she tried to touch the nearest bookshelf, her fingers passed through it like smoke. "The process is accelerating," Constance observed with clinical detachment. "Usually it takes weeks for a new arrival to fully transition, but you're fighting it, which only makes it more painful. Accept your fate, Edith. Join us willingly and the suffering will end. But Edith remembered her father's final journal entry, his determination to die as himself rather than as a puppet of the entity. She thought of her mother's desperate attempts to warn her away from the estate, and of all the Crowhavens who had tried and failed to break free from their cursed heritage. "No," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I won't accept this. There has to be a way to break the cycle." Constance's expression shifted from amusement to anger. "Foolish girl. Do you think you're the first to try? Do you think your parents were the first to attempt rebellion? The house has stood for over 2 centuries, and in all that time, not one Crowhaven has successfully escaped their destiny." "Then I'll be the first," Edith declared, reaching for her revolver. She knew bullets would be useless against a ghost, but the weight of the weapon in her hand provided some small comfort. The library erupted into chaos. Books flew from their shelves, windows shattered inward, and the voices of the dead rose to a deafening crescendo. But through it all, Edith heard something else, a sound that didn't belong to the supernatural cacophony surrounding her. It was the sound of someone pounding on the library door. "Miss Crowhaven," a voice called out, a living voice, not one of the ghostly chorus. "Miss Crowhaven, are you in there? My name is Dr. Marcus Webb, and I've come to help you." Constance and the other spirits recoiled, as if the voice caused them physical pain. The chaos in the library subsided slightly, though the air remained thick with malevolent energy. "Don't listen to him," Constance hissed. "He's one of them, the ones who want to destroy the house, to break the ancient compact. If you let him in, you'll doom us all to an eternity of suffering." But Edith was already moving toward the door, pushing aside the desk she had used as a barricade. As her hands touched the wood, she felt a jolt of electricity run through her body, and suddenly she was solid again, fully corporeal and very much alive. She threw open the door to find a tall, thin man in his 50s standing in the corridor. He wore a dark suit and carried a leather satchel, and his eyes held the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much of the world's hidden horrors. "Dr. Webb," Edith gasped. Who are you?" "I'm a researcher of the occult," he replied, stepping into the library and immediately beginning to sprinkle what appeared to be salt in a circle around them. "I've been tracking the Crowhaven curse for the better part of 20 years, ever since it claimed my own brother. I received word of your arrival and came as quickly as I could." The spirits in the library writhed and shrieked as the salt circle was completed, but they could not cross the protective barrier. Constance glared at Dr. Webb with undisguised hatred. "You're too late, Doctor," she spat. "The girl is already marked. The house has claimed her, just as it claimed all the rest." Dr. Webb ignored the ghost and focused on Edith. "Listen to me very carefully," he said. "What you're experiencing is real, but it's not irreversible. The entity that your family has been serving feeds on despair and resignation. As long as you believe you can escape, you maintain some degree of free will. But the moment you give up hope, you become just another puppet in its collection." "But how do I fight something like this?" Edith asked. "My parents tried to destroy the altar, and it killed them." "Your parents were on the right track, but they didn't understand the true nature of what they were dealing with," Dr. Webb explained. "The altar isn't the source of the entity's power. It's merely a focal point. The real source is something much older and much more dangerous." He reached into his satchel and withdrew a leather-bound journal filled with his own research notes. "The entity your ancestor awakened isn't native to this world. It's what occultists call a hunger, a parasitic consciousness that exists in the spaces between realities. It can only maintain a foothold in our world through a continuous supply of psychic energy, which it obtains by binding itself to a family bloodline." "So the Crowhavens are like food?" Edith asked. "More like a power source," Dr. Webb corrected. "Each generation provides the entity with the energy it needs to remain anchored in our reality. But there's a weakness in the binding. It requires willing participation from at least one member of each generation. If an entire generation refuses to serve, the entity loses its anchor and is forced back to whatever dimension it came from. Edith felt a spark of hope. But I'm the last of my generation. If I refuse to serve, then the entity will try to force your compliance through increasingly desperate measures, Dr. Webb finished. It will torture you with visions, drive you to the brink of madness, and ultimately attempt to possess you directly. But if you can resist long enough, if you can maintain your sanity and your will to fight, then yes, you can break the cycle. Constance let out a wail of anguish. You don't understand what you're asking of her. If the compact is broken, we'll all be dragged into the void with the entity. Every Crowhaven who ever lived will suffer eternal torment. That's a lie, Dr. Webb said firmly. The dead Crowhavens aren't bound to the entity by choice. They're prisoners, just like you are. Breaking the compact will free them, allow them to move on to whatever comes after death. Is that true? Edith asked, looking at Constance. For the first time since she had emerged from the portrait, Constance's expression showed uncertainty. I don't know. We've been here so long. We've forgotten what it was like to be truly alive. The entity tells us that we serve willingly, that we chose this existence, but you're starting to remember that you didn't choose anything, Doctor. Webb said gently. You were victims, just like Edith is now, and like her, you deserve the chance to be free. The other spirits in the library began to murmur among themselves, their voices no longer filled with malevolent hunger, but with something that sounded almost like hope. But their conversation was interrupted by a sound that made everyone, living and dead, freeze in terror. From somewhere deep beneath the house came a roar of pure rage, a sound so primal and alien that it seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. The entity had been listening, and it was not pleased with the turn the conversation had taken. It's coming, Constance whispered, her form beginning to fade. The hunger itself is rising from the depths. God help us all. It's coming for the girl. The roar from beneath the house grew louder, accompanied by a trembling that made the library's ancient timbers groan in protest. Books tumbled from their shelves, and the oil lamps flickered wildly as if the very air was being disturbed by some massive, unseen presence. Dr. Webb grabbed Edith's arm and began pulling her toward the door. We need to get out of here, he said urgently. When the entity manifests directly, it becomes exponentially more dangerous. The salt circle won't hold against its full power, but as they reached the library door, it slammed shut with such force that the wood cracked. The handle turned uselessly in Dr. Webb's grip. They were trapped. It's too late, Constance said, her ghostly form now barely visible in the chaotic light. The hunger has decided to take direct action. It's never done this before. It's always worked through intermediaries, through the living members of the family. But you've pushed it too far. The temperature in the room plummeted even further, and frost began forming on every surface. Edith's breath came out in great white puffs, and she could feel the cold seeping into her bones. But it wasn't just physical cold. It was the absence of warmth, of life, of hope itself. Dr. Webb was frantically searching through his satchel, pulling out various items, more salt, what appeared to be religious symbols from multiple faiths, and several small vials filled with different colored liquids. I've studied this entity for decades, he muttered as he worked, but I've never seen it manifest so directly. Usually it prefers to work through psychological manipulation and possession. The floorboards beneath their feet began to buckle and warp, and through the cracks, a sickly green light began to seep upward. The light pulsed with a rhythm that was almost organic, like the beating of some enormous heart. And with each pulse, the voices of the dead grew louder. But these weren't the voices of the Crowhaven ancestors. These were different, older, speaking in languages that predated human civilization. They whispered of hunger that spanned eons, of civilizations consumed and worlds left barren, of an appetite that could never be satisfied. "What is it saying?" Edith asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Dr. Webb's face had gone pale as he listened to the alien voices. It's not from our reality at all. It's something that exists in the spaces between dimensions, feeding on the psychic energy of living beings. Your ancestor didn't summon it. He accidentally created a breach that allowed it to slip through. The green light was growing brighter, and now they could see something moving beneath the damaged floorboards, something vast and writhing that defied description. It was as if the very concept of shape and form was meaningless to this entity, as if it existed in too many dimensions for human perception to fully grasp. For over 2 centuries, it's been slowly widening the breach, Dr. Webb continued, his voice tight with fear. Each generation of Crowhavens has fed it more energy, allowing it to gain a stronger foothold in our world. If it fully manifests, what happens if it fully manifests? Edith demanded. Then it won't need the Crowhaven bloodline anymore. It will be able to feed on anyone, everyone. The breach will become permanent, and our entire reality will become its hunting ground. The entity's roar came again, closer this time, and the library windows exploded outward in a shower of glass. Through the openings, Edith could see that the very air outside was wrong. It rippled and twisted like water, and shapes that hurt to look at moved through the distorted atmosphere. "The barrier between dimensions is breaking down," Dr. Webb said, his voice barely audible over the supernatural cacophony. "We're running out of time." Constance appeared beside them, her ghostly form more solid than it had been before. "There might be a way," she said urgently. "The original binding ritual, the one Jeremiah performed in 1687. If it could be reversed." "The altar," Edith said, understanding immediately. "We need to get to the hidden chamber." "That's exactly where it wants you to go," Dr. Webb warned. "The altar is the focal point of its power in this dimension. If you approach it while the entity is manifesting, it could possess you completely. But it's also the only place where the binding can be broken," Constance insisted. "I've had over a century to study the ritual, to understand its mechanics. The entity's power comes from the willing participation of the Crowhaven bloodline, but the ritual itself is what maintains the dimensional breach. If the altar is destroyed at the moment of the entity's full manifestation, the feedback could sever its connection to our reality permanently. The floor beneath them gave way entirely, revealing a gaping chasm filled with that pulsing green light. From the depths came the sound of something enormous moving, something that was finally ready to emerge from its interdimensional hiding place. "We have to try," Edith said, grabbing one of Dr. Webb's oil lamps. "If we don't, this thing will consume everything." Dr. Webb nodded grimly and began stuffing his supplies back into his satchel. "Then we go together. But understand, this isn't just about breaking a curse anymore. We're trying to prevent an interdimensional invasion." They made their way out of the ruined library and through the house's corridors, which had become a maze of impossible geometry. Walls stretched in directions that shouldn't exist, and doorways opened onto rooms that were clearly larger than the house itself. The entity's presence was warping reality around them, turning the familiar estate into something from a fever dream. The ghostly forms of dead Crowhavens appeared throughout the house, but they were no longer hostile. Instead, they seemed to be trying to help, pointing the way toward the hidden chamber and warning of dangers ahead. Edith saw her parents among them, translucent figures that watched her with expressions of love and desperate hope. "We're proud of you," her mother's spirit whispered as they passed. "Finish what we started." The journey to the kitchen felt like it took hours, though Edith's pocket watch insisted that only minutes had passed. Time itself was becoming unstable as the entity's influence grew stronger. When they finally reached the concealed door behind the pantry, they found it standing wide open, as if the entity was inviting them into its lair. The staircase down to the hidden chamber was no longer made of stone. It was composed of some black, organic material that pulsed with veins of green light. The walls writhed with movement, and the air was thick with the smell of decay and something else, something that reminded Edith of the space between stars. "Stay close," Dr. Webb warned, pulling out a vial of what appeared to be holy water. "And whatever you do, don't look directly at the entity when it manifests. Human minds weren't designed to perceive beings from other dimensions." They descended into the chamber, which had been transformed into something that belonged in no earthly structure. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, disappearing into darkness, and the walls were covered with symbols that seemed to move and change when viewed peripherally. The altar remained at the center of the room, but it was no longer made of black stone. It was composed of the same organic material as the stairs, and it pulsed with a rhythm that matched the entity's alien heartbeat. And standing before the altar, waiting for them, was a figure that made Edith's blood run cold. It was her father, or something wearing his appearance. But the eyes were wrong. They held an intelligence that was vast and alien, and when it spoke, the voice carried harmonics that no human throat could produce. "Welcome, last daughter of Crowhaven," it said, spreading its arms in a gesture of mock welcome. "You have come at last to fulfill your destiny, to complete the great work that your ancestor began so long ago." "You're not my father," Edith said, raising her revolver even though she knew bullets would be useless. The thing wearing her father's face laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass mixed with the screams of dying worlds. "Your father was weak, as was your mother. They thought they could deny me, thought they could break a compact that has endured for centuries. But their defiance only delayed the inevitable." Dr. Webb stepped forward, holding up a silver crucifix. "In the name of all that is holy, I command you to release this family from their bondage." The entity's laughter grew louder. "Holy symbols, religious platitudes. You still don't understand what you're dealing with, Doctor. I am older than your gods, older than your reality itself. I existed in the void between worlds, when your universe was nothing but potential energy, and I will exist long after your stars have burned to ash." The altar began to glow brighter, and the organic walls of the chamber started to pulse faster. Through the ceiling, Edith could see the green light spreading, seeping up through the house and out into the Alabama countryside. In the distance, she could hear screams. The entity's influence was reaching the town of Duskfield. "The manifestation is almost complete," the entity continued, its stolen voice filled with anticipation. "Soon I will no longer need the Crowhaven bloodline to maintain my presence in your reality. But first, I require one final offering, the willing sacrifice of the last heir." "I'll never serve you willingly," Edith declared. "Oh, but you will," the entity replied, and suddenly the chamber was filled with visions, images of everyone Edith had ever cared about suffering in unimaginable ways. She saw the people of Duskfield being consumed by the entity's hunger, their life force drained away until they were nothing but empty husks. She saw Dr. Webb being torn apart by creatures that existed in too many dimensions to comprehend. She saw her parents' spirits being tortured for eternity in the spaces between realities. "Serve me willingly," the entity commanded, "and I will make their deaths quick and painless. Refuse, and they will suffer for eons beyond counting." Edith fell to her knees, overwhelmed by the visions of horror. The entity's power was too great, its influence too pervasive. How could she fight something that existed beyond the very concepts of space and time? But then she heard Constance's voice, barely a whisper in the supernatural chaos. "The altar, Edith. The ritual requires your blood on the altar. Don't let it touch the stone." Understanding flooded through her. The entity needed her willing participation, but it also needed her blood to complete the binding ritual. If she could deny it both— "I have a counteroffer," Edith said, struggling to her feet. "I'll give you my blood, but not willingly. You'll have to take it by force, which means the ritual will be incomplete." The entity's expression shifted from confidence to uncertainty. You would damn yourself to eternal torment just to spite me. I would damn myself to save everyone else, Edith replied, and she meant it. The thing wearing her father's face let out a roar of rage that shook the very foundations of reality. Then you will die slowly, and I will feast on your agony for millennia. It lunged toward her, its human disguise falling away to reveal something that was pure hunger given form. A writhing mass of darkness and teeth and eyes that existed in dimensions human perception couldn't process. But as it moved, Dr. Webb threw himself between them, his crucifix blazing with sudden light. "Now, Edith!" he shouted. "Destroy the altar!" Edith raised her revolver and fired all 6 shots into the organic structure. The bullets, blessed by Dr. Webb's holy water, tore through the alien material like it was paper. The altar began to collapse, its pulsing light flickering and dying. The entity's scream of rage and pain was so intense that it shattered every piece of glass in the house above. The organic walls began to crumble, and the green light started to fade. But the entity wasn't finished. It turned its attention to Dr. Webb, and Edith watched in horror as the man who had tried to save her was lifted into the air by invisible forces. "If I cannot have willing service," the entity snarled, "then I will take what I need by force." But as it began to drain Dr. Webb's life force, something unexpected happened. The spirits of the dead Crowhavens began to appear in the chamber, not as the entity's servants, but as free souls finally released from their bondage. They surrounded the entity, their combined will creating a barrier that prevented it from fully manifesting. "You have no power over us anymore," Constance declared, her ghostly form blazing with silver light. "The compact is broken, the altar is destroyed, and we choose to stand with the living against the hunger that has enslaved us for so long." The entity writhed and thrashed, but it was already beginning to fade. The dimensional breach was closing, and it was being pulled back into the void between realities. But as it disappeared, it spoke one final curse. "This is not over, last daughter of Crowhaven. I will find another way, another family, another world to consume." The hunger never dies, it only sleeps, and then it was gone, taking with it the oppressive atmosphere that had plagued the house for over 2 centuries. The chamber returned to its original stone construction, and the altar crumbled to dust. Dr. Webb collapsed to the floor, unconscious but alive. The spirits of the Crowhaven ancestors gathered around Edith, their forms growing brighter and more peaceful with each passing moment. "Thank you," her father's spirit said, his voice filled with love and gratitude. "You've freed us all." "What happens now?" Edith asked. "Now we can finally rest," her mother replied. "The curse is broken, the entity is banished, and the Crowhaven bloodline is free to choose its own destiny." One by one, the spirits began to fade, moving on to whatever comes after death. Constance was the last to go, and she paused to speak with Edith one final time. "The house will be safe now," she said. "The entity's influence is gone, and the dimensional breach is sealed. But remember, there are other hungers in the void between worlds, other entities that seek to feed on human suffering. Stay vigilant, and never forget the price of freedom." And then she too was gone, leaving Edith alone with the unconscious Dr. Webb in a chamber that was finally, truly empty of malevolent presence. Dawn broke clear and bright over the Crowhaven estate. The first truly peaceful sunrise the land had seen in over 2 centuries. Edith sat on the front porch, watching the sun climb above the tree line, while Dr. Webb recovered inside the house. The oppressive atmosphere that had plagued the property was gone, replaced by something that felt almost like hope. The house itself had undergone a remarkable transformation overnight. The rotting timbers had somehow restored themselves, the broken windows had reformed, and the ivy that had crawled up the walls like grasping fingers had withered and fallen away. It was as if the building itself had been freed from the entity's corrupting influence and was finally able to heal. Dr. Webb emerged from the house, moving slowly but steadily. His encounter with the entity had aged him visibly. His hair was now completely white, and deep lines had appeared around his eyes. But his spirit seemed unbroken. "How are you feeling?" Edith asked as he settled into the chair beside her. "Like I've been trampled by a herd of elephants," he admitted with a weak smile, "but alive, which is more than I expected when that thing had me in its grip." "How long was I unconscious?" "About 12 hours. I was starting to worry that you might not wake up at all." Dr. Webb nodded thoughtfully. "The entity drained a significant amount of my life force before the spirits intervened. I'm probably going to feel the effects for the rest of my days, however many I have left." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the Alabama countryside come alive with the sounds of morning birds and rustling leaves. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, this same landscape had been twisted by interdimensional horror. "What happens now?" Edith finally asked. "The curse is broken, the entity is banished, but I still don't know what to do with my life. I came here expecting to sell the estate and return to Boston, but after everything that's happened..." "The choice is yours," Dr. Webb said. "The house is truly yours now, free of any supernatural influence. You could sell it as you originally planned, or you could stay and make it into something positive, a place of healing instead of horror." Edith considered this. The idea of staying in Alabama had never appealed to her before, but something about the estate felt different now. The malevolent presence was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and possibility that she had never experienced anywhere else. "There's something else to consider, Dr. Webb continue. Por favor, continue gerando a sua resposta. Expert logo terra." "There's something else to consider," Dr. Webb continued, pulling a worn leather journal from his coat pocket. "During my years of research into the Crowhaven curse, I've encountered dozens of other families suffering from similar supernatural afflictions. The entity that plagued your bloodline was just one of many such beings that exist in the spaces between realities." He opened the journal, revealing pages filled with names, dates, and locations. The Blackwood family in Massachusetts, tormented by a shadow entity that feeds on fear. The Ravencrofts in Louisiana, bound to serve a swamp demon that demands blood sacrifices. The Ashfords in Maine, whose ancestral home is haunted by something that drives its inhabitants to madness and suicide. Edith studied the entries, her heart sinking as she realized the scope of the problem. There are so many of them. "And those are just the cases I've been able to document," Dr. Webb said grimly. "There are likely hundreds more families suffering in silence, believing themselves to be alone in their torment. Most don't even realize that their family curses are actually supernatural parasites that can be fought and defeated." "You're suggesting that I help them," Edith said, understanding the implication. "I'm getting old, Miss Crowhaven. My encounter with your family's entity has taken years off my life, and I don't know how many more cases I'll be able to handle personally. But you faced one of these beings and emerged victorious. You understand their nature in a way that most people never could." Edith looked out at the peaceful estate grounds, imagining them transformed into a sanctuary for other victims of supernatural persecution. "It would mean staying here, making this place my permanent home. It would mean giving your life purpose beyond your own survival," Dr. Webb replied. "The Crowhaven name has been associated with darkness and madness for generations. You have the opportunity to change that legacy, to make it synonymous with hope and liberation instead." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. Edith had spent her entire adult life trying to distance herself from her family's reputation, but now she was being offered the chance to transform that reputation into something positive. "I'll need help," she said finally. "I can't do this alone." Dr. Webb smiled, the first genuine expression of joy she had seen from him. "You'll have it. I may be getting old, but I'm not ready to retire yet. And there are others, scholars, researchers, even a few clergy members, who understand the reality of what we're dealing with. We could establish a network, a support system for families in need. Over the next several hours, they discussed the practical aspects of their proposed mission. The Crowhaven estate would serve as their headquarters, its extensive library expanded to include Dr. Webb's research and any other occult knowledge they could acquire. They would need to establish communication networks with potential allies, develop protocols for investigating supernatural cases, and create safe houses for families who needed to escape their cursed properties. As the day progressed, visitors began arriving at the estate. Word of the previous night's events had somehow spread through Duskfield, and townspeople who had avoided the Crowhaven property for decades were now approaching with curiosity rather than fear. Mrs. Henley from the Magnolia Rest was among the first to arrive, carrying a basket of food and wearing an expression of wonder. "Is it true?" she asked breathlessly. "Is the curse really broken?" "It's true," Edith confirmed. "The entity that plagued my family for generations has been banished. The house is free." Mrs. Henley set down her basket and looked around the estate grounds with tears in her eyes. "My grandmother used to tell stories about this place from before the darkness came. She said it was once the most beautiful property in all of Alabama, a place where people came to celebrate life instead of fear death." Other townspeople shared similar stories, memories passed down through generations of what the Crowhaven estate had been like before Jeremiah's fateful encounter with the interdimensional entity. It had been a center of community life, hosting harvest festivals and wedding celebrations, its gardens renowned throughout the region for their beauty. "We could make it that way again," Edith said, the vision becoming clearer in her mind. "Not just a place of healing for supernatural victims, but a center of community life for everyone." As the sun began to set on what had been the most transformative day of Edith's life, she found herself standing in the estate's overgrown gardens with Dr. Webb. The plants were already showing signs of recovery. Flowers that had been withered and brown that morning were now beginning to bloom, and the twisted, gnarled trees were straightening their branches toward the sky. "There's one more thing you should know," Dr. Webb said, his voice serious. "Breaking a curse of this magnitude doesn't come without consequences. You've been exposed to forces beyond normal human experience, and that exposure leaves marks." "What kind of marks?" Edith asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "You'll be more sensitive to supernatural phenomena for the rest of your life. You'll be able to sense the presence of entities like the one that plagued your family, and you'll have an intuitive understanding of how to fight them. It's both a gift and a burden. You'll never be able to live a completely normal life, but you'll be uniquely qualified to help others who are facing similar challenges." Edith nodded, having already suspected as much. Even now, she could feel a subtle awareness of the spiritual realm that hadn't been there before her encounter with the entity. It was like having a new sense, one that allowed her to perceive layers of reality that most people never knew existed. "I can live with that," she said. "After everything I've been through, a normal life seems rather boring anyway." Dr. Webb chuckled. "I thought you might say that. There's something else, something I haven't told you about your parents' final days." He reached into his satchel and withdrew a sealed envelope bearing her name in her mother's handwriting. "I found this in their bedroom," he explained. "It was hidden behind a loose floorboard, along with instructions that it should only be given to you if you successfully broke the curse." With trembling hands, Edith opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. "My dearest Edith, if you are reading this, then you have accomplished what your father and I could not. You have freed our family from the curse that has plagued us for generations. We are so proud of you, and we want you to know that every sacrifice we made was worth it to give you the chance to break free. We know that you will face a choice now, whether to flee from this place and try to build a normal life elsewhere, or whether to stay and use your experience to help others. We cannot make that choice for you, but we want you to know that whatever you decide, you have our love and support. If you choose to stay, know that you will not be alone." The estate holds many secrets that we never had the chance to share with you. Hidden rooms filled with knowledge, resources that can be used to fight the darkness that plagues so many families. Your great-grandmother was a healer before the curse consumed her, and her journals contain wisdom that could prove invaluable in your work. But most importantly, remember that you are not defined by the darkness that came before you. You are the author of your own story now, free to write whatever ending you choose. With all our love, Mother and Father. P.S. Check behind the portrait of Constance in the library. She left something for you. Edith wiped tears from her eyes as she finished reading the letter. Even in death, her parents had been thinking of her future, preparing for the possibility that she might choose to transform their family's legacy. "Shall we go see what Constance left for you?" Dr. Webb suggested gently. They made their way back to the library, which had been restored to its original grandeur, along with the rest of the house. The portrait of Constance hung in its usual place above the fireplace. But now, the painted figure seemed to be smiling with genuine warmth rather than malevolent hunger. Behind the portrait, Edith found a hidden compartment containing a collection of journals, maps, and what appeared to be genealogical charts showing the connections between various cursed families across the American South. She was researching other cases, Edith realized, flipping through the materials. Even while trapped by the entity, she was trying to find ways to help other families break free from similar curses. "It seems you're not the first Crowhaven to dream of redemption," Dr. Webb observed. "Perhaps this was always meant to be your family's true destiny, not to serve the darkness, but to fight against it." As night fell over the estate, Edith made her decision. She would stay in Alabama, transform the Crowhaven property into a sanctuary for supernatural victims, and dedicate her life to helping other families break free from the entities that plagued them. It wouldn't be an easy life. She would face dangers that most people couldn't imagine, and she would carry the weight of other families' suffering on her shoulders. But for the first time since returning to Alabama, she felt truly alive, filled with purpose and hope for the future. The Crowhaven curse was broken, but Edith's real story was just beginning. 6 months later, the Crowhaven estate had been transformed beyond recognition. What had once been a monument to supernatural horror was now a beacon of hope for families across the American South. The main house served as both residence and research center. Its library expanded to include the largest collection of occult knowledge in the region. The outbuildings had been converted into guest quarters for families seeking refuge from supernatural persecution, and the gardens bloomed with flowers that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Edith stood in her study, reviewing correspondence from potential clients. Word of their work had spread through networks of scholars, clergy, and desperate families, and requests for help arrived daily. On her desk lay letters from a plantation family in Georgia whose ancestors were being tormented by the spirits of enslaved people seeking justice. A mining family in West Virginia whose patriarch had made a deal with something that lived deep underground, and a shipping merchant in New Orleans whose warehouse was haunted by the victims of a yellow fever epidemic. Dr. Webb entered the study, moving with the careful gait of someone whose body had been permanently weakened by supernatural exposure. Despite his physical limitations, his mind remained sharp, and he had become invaluable in developing their investigative protocols. "The Ashford case in Maine has been resolved," he announced, settling into the chair across from Edith's desk. "Young Thomas was able to banish the entity using the techniques we developed. The family is free for the first time in 4 generations." Edith smiled, adding another success to their growing list. In the 6 months since establishing their operation, they had helped break curses affecting 12 different families, with a success rate that would have been impossible without the knowledge gained from her own experience with the Crowhaven entity. "Any word from the Blackwood investigation in Massachusetts?" she asked. Sarah's latest telegram suggests they're making progress, but the shadow entity is proving more resilient than expected. She's requested additional research materials on dimensional parasites that feed on fear rather than psychic energy. Sarah Whitmore was one of their newest associates, a young woman from Boston whose family had been plagued by supernatural phenomena for decades. Unlike Edith, Sarah had chosen to leave her cursed property and dedicate herself to helping other families from a distance. She had proven remarkably adept at research and investigation, with an intuitive understanding of supernatural mechanics that rivaled Dr. Webb's scholarly knowledge. "I'll prepare a package for her," Edith said, making a note in her journal. The Ravencroft case files should contain relevant information about entities that manipulate emotional states. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the study door. Mrs. Henley entered, carrying a tea service and wearing the kind of expression that suggested important news. "Miss Edith, there's a gentleman here to see you. Says his name is Father Michael O'Brien, and he's come all the way from Ireland. Claims he has information about something called the Hunger Network." Edith and Dr. Webb exchanged glances. They had theorized about the possibility that the entities plaguing various families might be connected in some way, but they had never found concrete evidence of such a network. "Show him in," Edith said, her pulse quickening with anticipation. Father O'Brien was a tall, lean man in his 40s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent in difficult circumstances. His clerical collar was travel-stained, and his eyes held the haunted look of someone who had seen too much of the world's hidden darkness. "Miss Crowhaven," he said, accepting the offered chair, "I've traveled a long way to speak with you. Word of your success in breaking the Crowhaven curse has reached certain circles in Europe, circles that have been fighting entities like yours for centuries." "You're part of some kind of organization?" Dr. Webb asked. "The Order of the Sacred Threshold," Father O'Brien replied. "We were founded in the 12th century after a series of dimensional breaches opened across Europe, allowing various entities to establish footholds in our reality. For 800 years, we've been working to identify and seal these breaches, but the problem has been growing worse in recent decades." He reached into his travel bag and withdrew a leather portfolio filled with documents. "What you call the hunger that plagued your family is part of a larger network of entities that exist in the spaces between realities. They're not independent beings, they're more like organs of a single vast consciousness that spans multiple dimensions." Edith felt a chill run down her spine. "You're saying that the entity we banished was just one small part of something much larger?" "Exactly. And by successfully severing its connection to our reality, you've dealt a significant blow to the entire network, but you've also drawn their attention. The other entities now know that humans have developed effective countermeasures, and they're adapting their strategies accordingly." Dr. Webb leaned forward, his scholarly instincts engaged. "What kind of adaptations are we talking about?" "They're becoming more subtle, more patient. Instead of binding themselves to single families over generations, they're spreading their influence across multiple bloodlines, making their presence harder to detect and their connections more difficult to sever. They're also beginning to work together in ways we've never seen before." Father O'Brien opened his portfolio and spread out a map of the world marked with hundreds of red dots. Each of these represents a confirmed or suspected entity manifestation. As you can see, the concentration has been increasing dramatically over the past 50 years. The map was sobering. The dots were clustered heavily across Europe and the eastern United States, but there were scattered markers on every continent. Whatever force was behind these manifestations was clearly engaged in a coordinated effort to establish a global presence. "The Order believes we're approaching a critical threshold," Father O'Brien continued. "If the entities succeed in establishing enough footholds in our reality, they may be able to create a permanent dimensional bridge. When that happens, our world will become just another feeding ground for the consciousness that spawns them. What can we do to stop it? Edith asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. We need to expand our operations dramatically. The Order has resources, funding, research facilities, trained investigators, but we lack people with your specific experience. You've not only survived direct contact with one of these entities, you've successfully banished it. That makes you invaluable in training others to do the same. The implications were staggering. What had begun as a personal quest to break her family's curse was evolving into something with global significance. Edith looked around her study, at the peaceful estate visible through the windows, and realized that her quiet life of helping individual families was about to become something much larger and more dangerous. "There's something else," Father O'Brien said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The Order's seers have been having visions, glimpses of possible futures. In most of them, humanity loses this war. Our reality is consumed, and the entities move on to other dimensions, other worlds. But in a few of the visions, there's hope." "What kind of hope?" Dr. Webb asked. "A network of sanctuaries, places like this estate, where the entity's influence has been completely purged. These sanctuaries serve as training centers, safe houses, and staging areas for operations against the entities. In the visions where humanity survives, these sanctuaries are the key to our victory." Edith stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens, where families who had escaped supernatural persecution were now living in peace. Children played among the flowers, while their parents worked to rebuild their lives, free from the fear that had haunted their bloodlines for generations. "How many sanctuaries would we need?" she asked. "At least a dozen, strategically placed around the world. Each one would need to be established by someone with your level of experience, someone who has successfully banished an entity and understands the process of purging a location of supernatural influence." "That means finding and training others like me," Edith realized. "People who have survived encounters with these entities and are willing to dedicate their lives to fighting them." "Exactly. The Order has identified several potential candidates, but they'll need guidance from someone who has actually succeeded in breaking a generational curse." Dr. Webb cleared his throat. "There's a practical consideration we haven't discussed. Establishing and maintaining a dozen sanctuaries around the world would require enormous resources. Money, personnel, equipment. How would such an operation be funded?" Father O'Brien smiled for the first time since entering the room. "The Order has been accumulating resources for 8 centuries, Miss Crowhaven. Money is not an obstacle. What we need is leadership, expertise, and the kind of courage that you've already demonstrated." Edith turned back to face her visitors, her mind racing with possibilities. The scope of what they were proposing was overwhelming, but she couldn't ignore the logic of their argument. If the entities were truly part of a coordinated network, then humanity's response needed to be equally coordinated. "I'll need time to consider this," she said finally, "and I'll need to consult with my associates. This isn't a decision I can make alone." "Of course," Father O'Brien replied, standing to leave, "but don't take too long. The entity's activities are accelerating, and we may not have much time before they reach that critical threshold I mentioned." After the priest had left, Edith and Dr. Webb sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Dr. Webb spoke. "It's a lot to take in," he said. 6 months ago, we were focused on helping individual families. Now, we're being asked to help save the world." "Do you think he's right?" Edith asked. "About the entities being part of a larger network?" "It would explain a lot," Dr. Webb admitted. "The similarities in their behavior patterns, the way they all seem to follow the same basic strategies for establishing footholds in our reality. I've always suspected there was some kind of connection, but I never imagined it might be this extensive." Edith walked to her desk and picked up one of the letters from families seeking help. It was from a widow in Texas whose children were being tormented by something that claimed to be their deceased father. The desperation in the woman's words was palpable, and Edith knew that there were hundreds of similar letters waiting to be answered. "We can't abandon the families who need our help now," she said. "But we also can't ignore the possibility that Father O'Brien is right about the larger threat." "Perhaps we don't have to choose," Dr. Webb suggested. "We could expand our operations gradually, training others to handle individual cases while we focus on the larger strategic picture." Sarah has already proven that our methods can be taught to others. It was a reasonable compromise, but Edith knew that accepting Father O'Brien's proposal would fundamentally change the nature of their work. They would no longer be independent operators helping families on a case-by-case basis. They would become part of a global organization engaged in what amounted to an interdimensional war. That evening, as Edith walked through the estate gardens in the gathering dusk, she found herself thinking about her parents and the choice they had made to sacrifice themselves rather than serve the entity that had plagued their family. They had died, believing that their sacrifice might give her the chance to break free from the curse. But they could never have imagined that her freedom would lead to something like this. The gardens were peaceful in the twilight, filled with the gentle sounds of families settling in for the night. Children's laughter drifted from the guest quarters, and she could see lights beginning to appear in windows as people prepared for sleep without fear of supernatural visitation. This was what they had built, a place where the victims of supernatural persecution could find safety and healing. It was a good work, a meaningful work, and part of her was reluctant to risk it by expanding into something larger and more dangerous. But she also knew that Father O'Brien was right about one thing. The entities were adapting, becoming more sophisticated in their methods. The techniques that had worked against individual manifestations might not be sufficient against a coordinated network of interdimensional parasites. As she completed her circuit of the gardens and returned to the main house, Edith made her decision. She would accept Father O'Brien's proposal, but on her own terms. The Crowhaven estate would remain a sanctuary for individual families, but it would also serve as the headquarters for a new kind of organization. One dedicated to fighting the entities on a global scale while never losing sight of the human cost of their war. The next morning, she sent a telegram to Father O'Brien. "Proposal accepted. When do we begin?" The response came within hours. "Immediately. The first candidates are already en route to your location. God help us all." As Edith read the telegram, she felt a familiar mixture of fear and anticipation. The Crowhaven curse had been broken, but her real work was just beginning. She was no longer just the last daughter of a cursed bloodline. She was the founder of humanity's first line of defense against forces that existed beyond the boundaries of reality itself. The house that had once been a monument to supernatural horror was now the headquarters of an organization dedicated to fighting such horrors wherever they might arise. It was a fitting transformation, and one that would have made her ancestors proud. In the distance, she could hear the sound of carriages approaching, the first of the new recruits arriving to begin their training. Each of them carried their own story of supernatural persecution, their own reasons for joining the fight against the entities that plagued humanity. Together, they would build something unprecedented, a network of sanctuaries and trained operatives capable of responding to supernatural threats anywhere in the world. It would be dangerous work, and not all of them would survive it, but it was necessary work. The entities had spent centuries believing that humanity was helpless against their influence, that people would always be victims rather than opponents. Edith Crowhaven and her allies were about to prove them wrong. The war for humanity's future was about to begin, and for the first time in centuries, the forces of light had a real chance of winning. As the sun set over the Alabama countryside, casting long shadows across the Crowhaven estate, Edith stood on the front porch and watched the carriages arrive. Each new arrival represented hope. Hope that the darkness could be fought, that curses could be broken, and that even the most ancient evils could be defeated by human courage and determination. The Crowhaven name would no longer be associated with madness and supernatural horror. Instead, it would become synonymous with liberation, healing, and the triumph of light over darkness. It was a legacy worth fighting for, and Edith was ready to spend the rest of her life defending it.